I think we
Um,
were on C, survival and not seeing reality. Is that and the illusion of color in some of these? Are these some that
yeah,
you
I
want to
mean,
dive
so
into?
these all just kind of essentially iterate the same point, right? So, like virtual reality and perception, Hoffman compares our perception of the world to virtual reality. When you wear a VR headset, you experience a simulated environment that feels real, even though it's entirely constructed by software. In VR, you can interact with objects and navigate the environment, but everything you see is a representation, not the actual physical world, right? So he kind of goes on to show that. So these examples in chapter 1 of his book lay a foundation for Hoffman's argument that our perceptions are akin to a user interface designed by evolution to be practical and efficient for survival, but not necessarily accurate in revealing the true nature of reality around us. So he then goes on to talk about, through evolution, fitness over truth. And then he gives some examples of how that's prevalent. So, one of his central claims is that evolution favors fitness over truth. He uses the concept of fitness payoffs to explain that organisms evolved to maximize their chances of survival, not to perceive reality accurately. So these fitnesses or fitness payoffs are essentially, traits that we've inherited genetically that enable us to procreate and survive essentially. So he gives some funny examples though of how these fitness payoffs um, can sometimes cause us to do things that are stupid, right?
Yeah.
Because we don't perceive the truthfulness of the situation. Now, he gives examples in the animal kingdom primarily. So, like, he discusses a case of the jewel beetles in Australia, which evolved to seek out mates by identifying certain visual cues like color and texture. However, beer bottles left by humans in the environment, which happen to reflect light in a way that mimics these cues, attracts the beetles. So the beetles mistake the beer bottles for ideal mates and attempt to copulate with them, leading to a significant fitness cost, right? And then the beetle's perception system is not designed to accurately identify mates in all contexts, but rather to quickly identify what usually indicates a suitable mate. This system works well in a natural environment where the cues usually indicate other beetles. However, it fails in the presence of artificial objects that trigger the same perceptions but do not lead to successful mating. That I find super interesting, just that concept that this cue functions in a natural environment, but does not function in the presence of artificial objects. You think about reality today. How many artificial objects do we have that we interact with? Almost our entire world is man made. It's not natural, it's artificial.
Hmm.
And so you think about our fitness payoffs interacting with the non natural world.
Yeah.
That makes our perception of truth even more difficult, right? And then you have, these man-made contraptions that have learned how to prey on our fitness payoffs, right? So like for example, social media. I was watching a podcast from Joe Rogan where he was talking to the head of humane technology for Meta. And his job was to make sure that the algorithm was being used in a humane way. What he found out was that it was not. Wrote this, large paper to the would-be leaders at Meta and quickly got fired. But the gist of his paper was that what he had found was that the algorithm was essentially hacking the human brainstem, and it realized that maximal engagement was achieved through polarization and enraging. So what it was doing was it was taking these ideas that are fairly close, but causing them to look like they're not, and causing people to be divisive, polarizing, every topic that it could, so that we felt like we were super far apart when in reality we were fairly close, 98% overlap.
Yeah.
But the 2% where we don't have overlap, it's extrapolating into these huge problems. And then what it's doing is through that polarization, it's feeding you content that makes you angry, that enrages you.
Hmm.
Well, you think about what is that doing to the social fabric of society? Like, how polarized are we today between religion and science, Democrat, Republican, black, white? I mean, just on and on and on. It essentially creates this group identity thing. But the problem becomes that we have this fitness payoff where when someone is, opposed to us, it can cause us to be angry. But it's like that anger doesn't serve us well when it's being manipulated by a fictitious algorithm
Hmm.
that's utilizing our fitness payoffs in ways that aren't productive for us in order to maximally engage us on a platform where it can generate revenue. It's like, yeah, so it becomes difficult sometimes to, in these artificial circumstances, to control our inherited genetic fitness payoffs in ways that function properly amidst man's, creations.
I mean, there's a whole practical um, application here with any form of media, but maybe the worst and most destructive being pornography,
Yeah, absolutely.
right? So,
The
like,
fitness payoff of procreation,
yeah,
but being used in a way in which it doesn't ever actually procreate.
yeah.
Yeah.
And the wildest idea that, like, it's again your file example. This
Yes.
is on a screen. This
Yes.
is not
It's
real.
us mating with a bottle,
We're
just like the beetle.
yeah, we're
Yeah.
we're trying we are trying to mate with a bottle.
Yep.
If you
They've
watch
hacked
pornography,
they've hacked that fitness payoff
yeah,
in a way in which they can monetize it. So it's like, yeah, the problem becomes that the truthfulness of society around us, very difficult to perceive through our senses,
totally.
right? Which lends to Hoffman's idea that we don't perceive the truthfulness of reality through space and time.
Yeah, it would be like if I didn't know you, and I walked up to you on the street, and we were in a third world country, and in that particular third, and you were American and I was a native, and in that particular country, saying hello was this,
Yeah.
and you decided
Yep.
to punch me in the face,
Yeah.
and I would have no understanding as to why you did what you did, and you would
Sure.
have no understanding as to
Yes.
why, right? So it's almost like it's a
Communication barrier between the two.
yeah, and that's you know culture. There can be cultural misunderstandings through exactly what we're talking about as well.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, it permeates almost every aspect of reality.
Uh, um, a real conversation versus a conversation on the phone versus a text conversation.
Yep. Same thing.
How much more difficult is it to understand where somebody is coming from through
Oh yeah. How
text?
often do people misunderstand text message? Like, sorry, that's not what I meant. Right? Like, even I texted you over some of this. Like, that did not come across in the way I was thinking I was sending it across. I should have called you and been like, hey, Hoffman's, model of consciousness. But it just goes to show, right, that artificial means of communication um, don't accurately convey truth very well.
Yeah.
Yeah. So kind of interesting, talking about that. Now, mathematical models and simulation theory. I find this interesting. So, Hoffman introduces mathematical models to support his claims, including the use of evolutionary game theory. So, this is a topic I think we should try to explain clearly. I went fairly in depth here to understand what evolution game theory is and how it functions. So, these models demonstrate that organisms with perceptions aligned more closely to survival rather than truth have a better chance of succeeding in evolutionary terms. Hoffman also explores the idea that reality could be a form of simulation where our minds create the experience of objects, space, and time, much like virtual reality software. So, you know, it's interesting that we have this perception that we can, uh, you know, deductively or inductively deduce truth from our senses. But in Hoffman's modeling through evolutionary game theory, what he shows is that evolution does not favor truth. So, evolution game theory is a mathematical framework that models out how strategies or traits evolve in populations over time, driven by natural selection and the relative fitness payoffs of those strategies. Okay. Originally developed in economics, game theory studies strategic interactions between rational decision makers, where the outcome for each player depends on the choices made by others, a game. In this context, is any situation in which multiple players make decisions that affect each other's outcomes.
Mm.
Okay, so you can see how this becomes fairly complex because this would be like conscious agents interacting, and you give them certain traits, and based on those traits, they affect others around them. Okay, and then what you can do is you can mathematically model out if this trait permeates through the game or not, right? What happens to this trait in the game? Does it go extinct? Does it take over? Does it ebb and flow? So they can model out all of these different characteristics of genetic traits that we receive through evolution and see what is the more likely trajectory through evolution for us to have come to the state that we're currently in.
Mm.
Is it that we can perceive truth in reality or not? Well, what his findings are essentially is that there is a 0% chance of survivability of any player when truth is their absolute. If they're not modeled to fitness payoffs and they're modeled to truth, they do not survive in any of the games. Which is pretty, that's a pretty glaring difference to what we think of ourselves as rational truth comprehending beings. Right? So you have to really start to question some of these assumptions we have about our ability to perceive the truth through physical means.
But metaphysical, compartmentalized for you is different.
Outside of space and time, yes. I believe that truth can almost only be comprehended through metaphysical means, not by the physical nature of things around us, which would fly in the face of, say, scientific materialism, which is that all truth is found in the physical nature of things. Kind of the reductionist mentality, which is as we get to the bottom building blocks of the physical nature of the universe around us, we will know the truth of all. But that has not been the case. What we found is that as we get to the bottom of most things, it unlocks a form of contrary mathematical systems that don't function in space-time. Mainly, quantum mechanics.
Have you ever done any level of deep thinking on, different than simulation theory, but the idea that if you were going to if you sort of treated your life, particularly let's say in business,
Yep.
as a game, that your probability of achieving the highest rank in the game would be better than those who don't perceive the same game as a game, right? So
Yeah.
like I actually find that to be quite productive when you say like, and I've gotten to a
That's how I
place,
play business.
yeah,
I compete.
I've sort of gotten to a place where it's almost like, yeah, none of this matters that much, and it's
Yeah.
like sort of not real.
It's kind of a game.
So let's just like play it like you'd play a video game and have a little fun with it.
Yep.
And like, let's see how far we can go and if we can beat the final boss, kind of thing.
Well, what I
right?
love here is like, so I've been trying to teach my kids this, that winning in business is iterative failure.
Yeah.
So like we have this idea somehow that failure is bad. I think it comes from school, where when one doesn't pass, we equate fail to, not being able to pass a grade.
Yeah.
But in reality, failure is the only way to succeed. And it's iterative failure that causes us to become better, right? It's this process in the gospel. It would be self-reflection, repentance, commit to be better.
Yeah.
right? This is this virtuous cycle in religion that causes us to think about ourselves, repent and be better, receive further light and knowledge, think about ourselves, repent and be better, further light and knowledge, brighter and brighter until the perfect day. So it's that iterative failure process that enables us to climb the ranks of, becoming better, that allows us essentially to become the best at the game. But it's through analyzing our failure and learning, that we essentially can rise through the ranks of failure. But most people are too scared to even start because of the fear of failure.
I do think you're right. I think it's I think school, traditional education from a K through 12 is what, and then like the repercussions of failure, which is like your parents ground you. They do
Yes.
they
Yes.
you don't get
It's
to
all
play your sports
reinforced.
team.
Yeah.
You get
Yep.
expelled from the school. Like
Yeah.
there's all these like they hold you back if you're really
Yep.
bad, right? There's
Yep.
all these like ramifications. But I also find that you know the what you said on commit to be better, or the iterative part of failure, is obviously the key. And the people who are measured in society as the lowest of lows versus the people that are the highest of highs, the ones who are the lowest of lows continually fail and never learn and never
Well,
change.
you have this choice when you fail to either get bitter or to get better.
There you go.
And the bitter aspect of failure is the victim mentality.
Yeah.
It's that I am, it was something else. I'm externalizing my failure to something else and I'm blaming that.
I had no control.
And then I get angry about it, right?
Yeah.
Whereas on the better side, what I'm doing is I'm taking ownership of that portion, and then I'm committing to be better through learning how to overcome this failure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And like the people in the middle just sort of like
Aren't actually even thinking about it. They're just
aren't
kind of
thinking about it,
operating.
or they, from time to time they'll learn and other
Yeah.
times they're the victim. And
Yeah.
but it's like the most successful people ever are, I mean, it's not that they've failed more per se, it's that more consistently when they fail, they have a
Learn
process
from it.
around
Yeah,
learning
for
and
sure.
growing, right?
And to be honest, they probably have failed more. When you look at like most billionaires,
Yeah.
almost all of them have been through some type of financial collapse in
Yeah.
their life, which is like an epic failure.
Take way bigger risks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like you build up these massive teetering towers, and it's like when you fall, you do fall hard. You fail at a level that very few people will ever experience, because the weight of the gravity of the situation when you fail is so much greater. But that's a principle that I think is true, that permeates all of reality, is that if you want to get strong, you have to lift heavy weight.
Yeah.
And so you'll never be as strong as somebody who lifts heavier weight.
I tend to think people like Elon Musk really understand game theory,
Oh, and his lift is
because
monstrous.
I just don't think he cares if he just goes,
Yeah.
Whatever.
Yeah.
Like
Right.
if I lose everything tomorrow, I'll just
Get it
do
all
it
back.
again.
I'll get it. Well, and this is
Right.
understanding. A lot of people look at the destination and think that that is the desirable aspect of the journey.
Yeah.
But it's not. It's who one becomes in the journey that enables them to get to the destination.
Yeah.
Right? You can't even get to the destination if you don't become who you're supposed to on the way.
Yeah.
Because if you try to shortcut that, like you win the lottery, well, 90% of you are going bankrupt again.
Yeah.
Right? Because you
Totally.
don't have the skill set to maintain the wealth at that level. But it's, that's a true principle, is you can't take a shortcut to the top. So I used to give a talk a lot of times in like, coaching business owners or whatever. And I would do this funny thing where I would say, I'm going to give you the secret to winning. But before I give you the secret to winning, I would go through all these different aspects: hard work, discipline, right? All these different things. And then I would wait until I was out of time and they were going to kick me off stage. And I would never give the secret to winning. But what I had actually given was the secret to winning, which was all the small things you have to do in order to win. There is no secret to winning.
Yeah.
But I would have people that come up to me all the time afterwards and be like, "Hey,
What was it?
yeah, you never gave us the secret."
You missed it, man.
I'm
You
like,
missed it.
well, come next time and we'll see if you can figure it out. Teaching in parable, right? So that those who are ready to receive could understand that that there is no secret to winning. It's duplicatable through, these simple actions that one can take in their own life and build
Yeah.
precept upon precept, line upon line, precept upon precept.
It'd be an interesting marketing ploy. You, as somebody who's, been in finance your whole career, is marketing that you are the lottery winner money manager slash fund manager. So it's like, I
Yeah.
only work with people who've won the lottery.
Yeah.
Just if you win a lottery, call me.
Problem is that would be chaos. They would literally have to sign like a limited power of attorney where I could be the decisive person on their funds, because at the end of the day, they're in control of their own assets. And regardless of the advice that I give them, they're going to make those decisions based on their, perception of reality.
Yeah.
And so they would just lose it regardless. You'd like to think you could be a steward over it, but you can only teach correct principles. People have to govern themselves.
Yeah.
So evolutionary game theory, I mean, we kind of talked through that. It's essentially understanding that you can build a model that shows these different traits. So what Hoffman found was that, different ways of perceiving the world, truth perception versus fitness-based perception, can be thought of as a competing strategy. Evolutionary game theory is used to simulate which perception strategy would be more successful in terms of survival and reproduction. Hoffman's model shows that fitness-based perception strategies tend to outcompete truthful perception strategies. So that would say that through evolutionary biology, we essentially have not been designed to understand truth.
It's sort of like, even if you're the most educated master slash PhD and you have all the knowledge and all the truth, it doesn't mean you're going to win the game.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is that fair?
Well, even if all of your knowledge and truth is tied to space and time, I don't think you win.
Yeah.
I mean, I know for me in business, the success I've achieved has come on the back of moments where I was met with a challenge I could not see how to fix myself.
Yeah.
And I received inspiration. I call it divine intervention, that enabled me to see a way out of the situation I was in.
Yeah.
But I had exhausted all physical means for me before I made a plea to a higher state of consciousness that enabled me to find the solution. So, even anecdotally for me, this rings true in my success in business.
Yeah.
Some of it can be controlled by naturalistic means, but there comes a point in time where you can't do it through naturalistic means, I don't think, which is similar to like the explanation of truth we'll get into as we get into like the Planck scale and some of those other aspects of quantum physics. But what's interesting to me is Hoffman then talks about consciousness being fundamental in order to understand truth. And he talks about how there are two things that are required in order for him to be able to give a theory of consciousness. The first, he says, is that the theory of consciousness has to have a mathematically precise theorem. And so, to create a theorem that is mathematically precise that models consciousness. And then the second is to be able to map that onto physics, which is to take it from the abstract of math. And what physics is modeling the real world around us through mathematics. So he's essentially saying we got to take this conceptual mathematical model that's precise for consciousness and map it into physics, which then will allow us to create or to conduct real world experiments to verify the validity of our mathematical model, right? Because that's how science proves things.
Yep.
Is through experiment. And so that's kind of what Hoffman does. So we can get into kind of talking about the flow for the theory of consciousness that is mathematically precise, and how does he do that? This to me is brilliant and earth-shattering in some of its you know, some of its meaning. So the diagram flow chart essentially goes like this. At the top level, we start with multiple conscious agents interacting. Okay? So conscious agents interacting. These interactions are mathematically described by what are called decorative permutations. We'll get into that. Okay, we'll give an in-depth explanation of what a decorative permutation is. Those decorative permutations then define the structure of a shape called the amplituhedron. Okay? Now, the amplituhedron is a shape that exists outside of space-time and has highly predictive capabilities in predicting physics. Okay, we'll get into that too. That is amazing. And then the amplituhedron essentially shows us how the mathematical consciousness model can emerge into space-time. Okay, so we go from the theoretical mathematical model to a mapping of that model through decorative permutations. The decorative permutations outline the shape of an amplituhedron, which exists outside of space-time but gives finite explanations for physics in space-time. And so the amplituhedron can model the decorative permutation into space-time. So you're going from consciousness to mathematics to space-time, which would say that space-time, the effects in space-time of consciousness are emerging from consciousness, the fundamentality of consciousness.
Mm.
And what's interesting, we talked about this a little before we started the podcast, but what Hoffman finds is that in the mathematical modeling of consciousness, there are infinite dimensions that can be placed into the mathematical model. When one places 4 dimensions, 3 for our perception and 1 for time, the artifacts that come out of that mathematical model are space-time. So they emerge from consciousness, which would say that consciousness is more fundamental than space-time, because we cannot in consciousness, or we cannot in space-time, find a way to define consciousness, right? Neuroscience has no way of explaining through physical means how consciousness arrives. So let's delve into it, okay? So at the top level, we said we start with multiple conscious agents interacting. So conscious agents interact through a network or systems where each agent has experiences and makes decisions based on those experiences. These interactions involve the exchange of conscious experiences, which include perceptions, intentions, and actions. Okay, so that's essentially a breakdown of how we function. Our perception, then our interaction, and then the action we take based on that perception and interaction, right? That's essentially how conscious agents function. And so they model that out mathematically. Each agent's decision impacts the experiences of other agents, forming a dynamic system where reality is perceived by an individual agent, where reality as perceived by an individual agent emerges from these interactions. This model suggests that what we perceive as the physical world is essentially a user interface created by the collective interactions of conscious agents, designed to hide the underlying complexity of these interactions and present data in a simplified form that aids survival and decision-making. Now, they do this conscious agent interaction through what's called Markovian dynamics. So Markovian dynamics is a mathematical model in which you can essentially create independent agents, give them properties, and see how they would interact with each other and what the outcome of that interaction is. As these two agents interact, it creates a new agent as the action, okay? And these agents can combine. And what's super interesting in the modeling of the conscious agents through Markovian dynamics that Hoffman found is that eventually it goes up to an infinite uh, intelligence. And that infinite intelligence cannot be modeled.
Could you call that infinite intelligence also an agent?
Yes, it
It's like
is.
the
He
grandmaster
actually he
agent.
actually uses the term agent.
Yeah.
So he says it goes up to an all-encompassing agent. Because what happens is as the lower agents interact, they combine to become these higher levels of agents with more properties and abilities to interact. But eventually the model goes all the way up to an all-encompassing agent who houses all of the intelligence of the agents below, all of the conscious interaction of all agents through these Markovian dynamic studies.
It's kind of like your breathwork journey.
Yes. Yes. It
Right?
takes all of the conscious interaction of agents
Yeah.
and pulls them up to a single greater conscious agent.
Yeah, I wrote down the question, where did the conscious agent decision criteria begin?
Yeah. They start it very simply. So like when they model the at the beginning, it's like the conscious agent, one has the ability to see red, one has the ability to see green. When these two interact, they produce a conscious agent who can now see yellow, right? So an additional color on the color spectrum. And so that just continues, right? It escalates into more comprehensive and more able conscious agents.
But if you apply this to reality, right? Because the idea behind this model is that this is actually how we're living, right? Is
Yes.
like it started out with one
Yep.
agent,
Yep.
which we would say is God,
Yep.
and then he created
Well,
a
in
few.
in the Markovian dynamic simulation, each of these lower agents is actually an image of the higher agent.
There you go.
That's how it functions,
Yeah.
all the way down to the simplest agents. They're all essentially a form of the all encompassing agent in some way, shape, or form.
Hmm.
Right? Pretty interesting. And then you can get into, I would encourage you if you want to look into it more. So, like Markovian kernels, which is a way to emulate each agent. And then they have Markovian kernel trails, which essentially shows like, gosh, how do you explain that? It shows essentially like the cumulative experience of the agent. So it's like, man, they can just model out some very brilliant things mathematically through Markovian dynamics. So if you want to look up, Hoffman, conscious agents, Markovian dynamics.
How new is this?
Really new.
Like the last 5 years, 10 years?
Well, Hoffman's been on it since 94, but I think he published his first paper just maybe 2 years ago. And it's now been cited and is starting to be used. And he published one called Fusions of Consciousness. It's a tough read because it's mathematically based, but you can get into it. And then he's going to publish another one. It's not called Fusions of Consciousness, but it's called something else. But yeah, I mean, a lot of this is in current progress. So like the Amplituhedron, which we'll talk about, which is this geometric shape outside of space-time, which has predictive capabilities into space-time. That thing is brand new.
So are these like are these like machine learning models that they're building essentially here?
Some of them can be, yes.
And like sort of continuous improvement models that like are ingesting data
Information,
from
yeah.
where?
Yeah. So they're using quantum computing in a lot of this. But what's interesting is like when we get into the decorative permutations and amplituhedron portion of the mathematical, theorem for conscious agents, these actually highly simplify predictive measures in space-time. So, like to give you an example, the Large Hadron Collider. You know what that is? It's this massive hadron collider that they built somewhere in Europe. I can't even remember. But what it has the ability to do is to accelerate particles to insane speeds, and then it collides them. And then they measure what happens when those particles collide. And it's like these high energy states where these particles are hitting at just astronomical speeds. And then it's creating these wild phenomena that we've never been able to, see, because we haven't been able to observe and monitor particles colliding at such massive energy levels. But in order for them to do the calculations around these particle collisions, you have like, you know, mathematical calculations that are in the millions of permutations. Okay. So you're talking about like, they're called Feynman diagrams, is how they map like particle scattering in space time. So they have these Feynman diagrams that are super complex, where it's millions of layers on top of each other, or millions of mathematical permutations of layers on top of each other, in order to accurately predict how these particles are going to act when they collide at these massive energy levels. Well, the Amplituhedron, this geometric shape outside of space and time, has predictive capabilities where it can take a million permutation mathematical computation of particle scattering and do it in a single permutation, or maybe three permutations instead of a million. And the reason it becomes so difficult on this side is because they're functioning in space-time. The Amplituhedron is functioning outside of space-time. And what it's showing is that this is more fundamental.
Mm-hmm.
And it has high predictive capabilities into space-time based on its geometric shape, which is wild to think about. So it goes from conscious agent interaction to the description of that mathematically is called decorative permutations, or decorated permutations, okay? They're mathematical objects that extend traditional permutations by adding additional attributes, are markings to each element, enhancing their ability to model complex systems with extra layers of information. In Hoffman's work, the concept of decorated permutations is used to help conceptualize how conscious agents, fundamental entities in his theory of consciousness, interact and create the fabric of perceived reality. Decorated permutations in this theoretical framework are not used in the conventional mathematical sense, but rather as a tool to illustrate complex interactions between these conscious agents and the emergence of reality as we perceive it. Okay, so modeling interactions. In Hoffman's theory, conscious agents interact with each other according to specific rules or protocols. These interactions can be thought of as permutations of the states of experiences, where decorations on these permutations could represent additional properties or qualities of these interactions, such as emotional or cognitive states. Okay? Decorated permutations in this context serve as a mathematical model to describe the vast and complex network of these interactions, capturing both the structural permutation and the qualitative aspects. So like the being and then the characteristics of the being. Okay? Permutation, decorations.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's able to take the being and all of its attributes and model them out mathematically against each other. Okay, they're called decorative permutations, which is like cutting edge physics. Okay, then what the decorative permutation does is it maps to what's called an amplituhedron. Okay, so Hoffman's integration of concepts like amplituhedron with conscious agents suggests a geometric or topological representation of these interactions. Here, decorative permutations could theoretically help map out individual interactions. Okay. Scale up to form higher dimensional structures like the amplituhedron, which in his theory could correspond to larger scale conscious experiences or shared realities. The amplituhedron itself in theoretical physics is used to simplify calculations of particle interactions in quantum field theory. By analogy, in Hoffman's work, it could symbolize how complex interactions of conscious agents simplify into a coherent structure that performs our perceived reality. Okay, so do you get what they're saying here? So the amplituhedron in, say, quantum physics has the ability to take mathematical theories of, say, particle scattering, project it into space time, and let you know how that's going to act, right? What particle scattering is going to take place and how in space time. What Hoffman's doing is he's taking that same ability of the amplituhedron, but doing it through with conscious agents. So he's built a mathematical formula for conscious agents. It's mapped out in an amplituhedron and then can show in space-time how those conscious agents will function, how they create reality, which is essentially what we do is we create reality, which we'll get into some of the experiments that show, the scientific experiments that show that space-time is not fundamental, that we create it through different interactions, some of them consciousness, you know? So we can skip a few more of these points, but, from theory to emergent phenomena, implications for reality and perception, philosophical and theoretical contributions. Those all come out of this mathematical model of consciousness. I don't want to bore people that are listening, but there are some interesting ramifications. So like we'll just go through the philosophical and theoretical contributions here. So this approach challenges the traditional materialist view where consciousness is a product of physical processes. Instead, it posits consciousness as the fundamental building block of reality, with physical phenomena emerging from it. The use of decorative permutations in this context is innovative, as it provides a potential mathematical and conceptual tool to bridge the gap between abstract entities, conscious agents, and the tangible structured universe. So the opposite of, right, what you read earlier when I said I take exemption to them saying, you know, the functioning apparatus of the brain and emerging from that consciousness. And I said, no, I think it's consciousness. And then the neural networks emerge from consciousness. That's what this is showing mathematically.
Yep.
Okay. So the third level then is the decorative permutations define the structure of the amplituhedron. Now, how does one conceptually understand a shape outside of space-time? It's a difficult mental exercise, okay? I tried to break it down into a way in which we might be able to generally understand it. But when you're thinking about shapes outside of space-time, it becomes very difficult because those shapes are not three-dimensional. They're not limited to 3 dimensions. They can have infinite dimensions. But by measuring aspects of those shapes, we can get predictive qualities of what would happen in space-time of different things. Interaction of conscious agents, collision of particles, eventually neuron firings in the brain, right? And how consciousness emerges into the neuron and synapses firings of the brain. We'll be able to model that out in space-time and show that consciousness is fundamental, and that the physical happenings inside of the brain are as a result of consciousness as fundamental. Okay. So the amplituhedron is a fascinating mathematical construct in theoretical physics that offers a radical way of understanding particle interactions without relying on the traditional space-time framework. This concept primarily developed in the context of N4 supersymmetric Yang-Mills framework. So supersymmetry, if you want to understand that, you can look it up. But that's essentially saying that there are particles that we have not discovered that exist in order to balance the symmetry of the world. Okay, you have in supersymmetry, you have fermions and bosons. So fermions constitute matter, bosons mediate interactions. So matter, electrons, quarks, neutrons, whereas the interactions are different elements. Okay, so those two essentially are the makeup of the universe. And in supersymmetry, they believe that there are equally balanced fermions and bosons on each side of the universal equation. Okay. It would take forever to get into supersymmetry, but if you look it up, you can get a pretty cursory understanding of it in an hour or
Mm-hmm.
two and kind of understand how it functions. So the Amplituhedron comes out of supersymmetry. So this concept provides insight into how physicists can calculate particle interaction probabilities using purely geometric and topological properties, a simplified way of doing quantum mechanics. So quantum mechanics is the prediction of the interaction of particles. Okay, is essentially what quantum physics is.
Yep.
It's understanding the interaction of particles in different ways in the universe. So, like I said, what the Amplituhedron does is it simplifies how we can calculate the interaction of particles in space-time, as opposed to, say, using Feynman digraphs or other more antiquated functions of trying to calculate particle interaction. So, quantum field theory, calculations of particle interactions, specifically scattering amplitudes, are performed using Feynman diagrams. These diagrams represent interactions in space-time with lines and vertices depicting the paths and interactions of particles. The complexity increases exponentially with the number of particles and interactions, making calculations cumbersome. So that's what I was talking about, where you might have 1 million permutations in order to calculate a complex, high-energy particle collision.
Mm-hmm.
And they've got to use quantum computing mechanics in order to even get to those things. It can't be done by hand mathematically because it's too complex. Whereas the Amplituhedron, which is outside of space-time, what the decorative permutation, the mathematical decorative permutation, essentially shows us the shape of the Amplituhedron. And from the shape of the Amplituhedron, we can draw physical interactions of particles. Okay. So that's kind of how the mathematical theory for conscious agents functions. And through the Amplituhedron, they'll be able to essentially bring it into space-time and make predictive, theories.
So the entire idea there
Yep.
is the foundation for all of this is consciousness,
Correct.
which leads to very precise mathematics,
Yep.
which leads to space-time, and not to be confused as the inverse.
Correct.
Yeah.
So yeah, the basis of the argument is that consciousness can be modeled mathematically. That model can create predictive shapes outside of space-time, which have qualities that infer predictive capability in space-time.
Yeah.
So space-time emerges as an artifact of the mathematical theory of consciousness.
It's just one part of consciousness.
Yeah.
What are the other parts?
That's the thing, is it's like I said, the consciousness model that Hoffman builds has infinite dimensions. We operate in 4. So what would be 5 dimensions?
Yeah.
6, 7, 8. What are the artifacts that fall out of the consciousness mathematical model at multiple dimensions?
Yeah.
And then what's crazy is, as you get into more dimensions, inside of those dimensions, you have certain hierarchies. So you run into like Cantor's hierarchy of infinities, which essentially says that there is like infinite possibilities of hierarchies inside of consciousness that can be boiled down to, certain parameters or limits inside of each conscious agent. And so it becomes very difficult to comprehend from a finite perspective. But if you can kind of let go of this bias you have of the physical world around you and, contemplate these things theoretically, there's some powerful abstract concepts that come out of that have highly predictive capability in space-time. Okay. So then from the Amplituhedron, we go essentially into space-time emerges from the underlying geometry of the amplituhedron. Okay. So that's kind of Hoffman's theory of conscious agents, the mathematical theory behind it, how that models into consciousness, and how that would essentially create, gosh, just a radical shift in how we perceive and calculate the world around us. Because general relativity, which has been the basis for mathematics and physics for hundreds of years, would be proven to be a minor portion of the reality of physics, right? And relativity, which Einstein created and has been thought as the basis for theoretical physics for the last, 100 years, would be rendered fairly obsolete in that way. And what's interesting is as quantum physics continues to discover deeper aspects of the universe, I've heard some very bright physicists say that space time is doomed. And so, what I kind of get into next is some of the experiments around space time
Mm-hmm.
and how it really starts to break down when you get into some of these quantum physics experiments.